Did AMD's attack on NVIDIA actually go wrong this time around? Or let's put it this way, does Team Red sabotage their own RX 5700 with the new Radeon RX 5600 XT? Please excuse that, well, cliché clickbaity video title, but there is some truth to it, you'll see. This launch didn't necessarily go all too well for AMD, to put it mildly. So today there's a lot I have to tell you about, especially what you should look out for when buying such a graphics card, or at least a similar one. It seems NVIDIA has finally managed to get even AMD into their pricing, performance and feature policy. In the case of today's card, AMD didn't even have a choice anymore if they wanted this newly announced GPU to be successful and relevant. For today's test, I've got myself the Sapphire RX 5600 XT Pulse. At the time of this video, this version comes in at about $290 US. And those that pay close attention to the GPU market and its prices probably know that there's some kind of overlapping going on with the current SKUs out, at least in terms of pricing. So comparing against the RX 5700 seems very much justified here. And sure, there's the question, can the 5600 XT even compete with NVIDIA's current offerings out there? A quick little thank you goes out to Georgios of the German PC hardware shop named Equipper for the fast delivery and the small discount I received. Worked perfectly as always. No worries, I paid everything out of my own pocket. No sponsoring going on here whatsoever. It's sad, but I have to mention that, otherwise nasty comments are guaranteed. Now before I go too much into detail about the graphics card, let's first take a look at what the AIB Sapphire has done with their version. And boy, let me tell you, for a 5600 XT, the manufacturer did a really good job, maybe even a little too good of a job. We are of course getting Sapphire's popular, very good and quiet cooler slapped onto the GPU. As you can see from the dimensions of the graphics card, at a length of 254mm, it's not necessarily a long GPU, but a rather high one. 135mm is the height. Now as for the looks, the aesthetics, whether you like or dislike it, I must say it's well done. Despite the fact that plastic is mainly used for a shroud, it's very well built. A nice little touch in my opinion is that aluminum mesh on the shroud. Also, Sapphire slapped a pretty fancy metal backplate onto this GPU. Something that's impossible to overlook is the dual BIOS switch. With the switch on the right side, as it is on default, we are running the card in its performance mode. If you switch to the left BIOS, we are talking of some sort of silent mode with reduced clock speeds. We'll get back to the topic BIOSes shortly. What I also love is the fact that Sapphire has, just like many other manufacturers by now, decided to implement semi-passive cooling, meaning the fans will remain off at idle or under light loads. This prevents unnecessary noise, plus no unnecessary dust buildup inside a card, and the fan lifespan is preserved a little, even though it needs to be said the fans already come with some pretty good bearings. The highlight here, though, is not so much the semi-passive cooling, but the incredibly low noise levels of this graphics card, even under full load. This happens to be the quietest card I've ever tested in this performance range, by far. While I've done all my testing, there was not one moment this GPU acoustically distracted me whatsoever. I'd even go this far and say this thing is practically inaudible at full load when gaming. That doesn't happen very often, as you may imagine. Now that's what we call a good cooling design. The Sapphire Pulse model also happens to come with a little bit of lighting. The Sapphire logo lights up in red, matching the whole AMD Radeon theme. However, as far as I know, the color cannot be changed. At least I haven't noticed any option of this type in the Sapphire Tricks software. Just a single 8-pin PCIe power connector is required to get this card powered up, so it really can't draw all that much power. But what exactly did I want to tell you about so much? All sounds perfectly normal so far. Well, in order to understand the situation a little better, I have prepared a list with 4 different graphics cards. I've picked one of the cheaper versions for each and have also written down the mean value for you guys. In terms of pricing, such a new RX 5600 XT lies exactly between the GTX 1660 Super or 1660 Ti and an RTX 2060. The problem for AMD is, before the 5600 XT even officially hit the shelves, NVIDIA has made some models of their RTX 2060 more attractive when it comes to pricing, and that really didn't go according to plan for AMD. This would mean AMD launched a mediocre, if not even a GPU with a worse price to performance ratio. That would have been an embarrassment. And what is there to do in such a case? You either lower the prices, adjust those, just like AMD did with their RX 5700 series back when it launched, but it seems this wasn't possible this time around, or they simply didn't want to do that. And yeah, so there's only one option left. The performance of the graphics card somehow needs to be increased, so that it no longer goes against the GTX 1660 Super or 1660 Ti by NVIDIA, but instead against the RTX 2060, basically the next performance class. How exactly could you do this? Drastic overclocking had to happen. Actually, that wasn't much of a problem, since the RX 5600 XT apparently only seems to be a slimmed down RX 5700 anyway. The bad thing, however, at the time AMD made this decision, many of such 5600 XT cards in its original form were ready to be sold already. So from a technical aspect, there's nothing that could be changed anymore at that point. So AMD's panic reaction was to quickly allow for tweaked BIOS versions for their 5600 XT. With such an overworked BIOS, not only the GPU clock, but also the GDDR6 memory clock was increased drastically, surely also followed by power limit increases, so the graphics card is allowed to draw more power than originally intended. What does that mean for us consumers at the end of the day? All of you that go out and buy yourself a 5600 XT now most likely will get one of those slower original cards. All cards produced after AMD's decision will be shipped with the new BIOS. AIBs such as Sapphire, luckily however, provide good and relatively simple user-friendly tools with batch files to use in order to flash the new BIOS version. Generally speaking, it's no big deal, but such a process is not 100% risk-free. Believe it or not, I had bad luck. There apparently was some kind of issue with the Windows administrator rights, and that bricked my BIOS. I was left with a black screen and the graphics card would no longer boot or output a video signal. And in cases like these, it's like a gift from heaven having two BIOS chips on board. Thanks to the second BIOS, I managed to recover and restore my first BIOS, and it worked brilliantly the second time around. Now with that experience, I do not intend to scare you away. No, actually it's quite rare for something to go wrong, but it can happen. If you, however, happen to have two BIOS chips, as in my case, the risk is very low, since it's easy to recover from bad flashes. But now to the topic, sabotage. What's actually the difference between a 5600 XT and the RX 5700? Not all that much, as it turns out. The majority of differences can be found in the video memory side of things. The 5700 comes with 8GB of GDDR6 VRAM, the 5600 XT with just 6GB. Aside from that, the bus width of 192 bits is quite a bit lower than the 256-bit one seen on the RX 5700. The amount of shader units, however, are completely identical. Let's compare the 5600 XT with the RTX 2060 by NVIDIA, and we quickly realize, on paper at least, these are two very similar graphics cards. I find it a bit of a bummer though that AMD has now more or less copied NVIDIA's moves when it comes to playing those VRAM games with us consumers. We no longer get those standardized 8GB we often got with AMD. Worth mentioning is the fact that the RTX 2060 does offer ray tracing on a hardware level, which AMD currently doesn't offer. But I already see it. It's going to be one long video, which is why I don't want to beat around the bush. Take a look at my benchmarks. I took the time to do additional testing for you guys with the old as well as the new BIOS. right. As you saw yourselves, the new BIOS does wonders. I mean, the performance AMD had planned originally for us at the same price, it wouldn't have been bad. But in terms of price to performance ratio, it wouldn't have looked exactly great. Thanks to those factory overclocks, thanks to the new BIOS, the RX 5600 XT in most of the game titles can take the lead over NVIDIA's RTX 2060. Not by much, but still. Of course, there also are games that run better with the NVIDIA GPU, we get more FPS. What I couldn't help but notice though is that the 5600 XT has some really good 1% low minimum values. This is where AMD often leads by a lot. Something that can't be unseen though is the situation with the RX 5700. In many games with the 5600 XT, we hardly ever drop behind an RX 5700 that much. There are times we are pretty much talking of a tie. To be fair though, the difference in pricing between these two GPUs is not that big either. While one could ask oneself once more what the point of this is, we just have to look over to NVIDIA. That question could easily be asked 10 times by now. Sometimes we simply don't need more graphics cards. The small premium for the RX 5700 does bring 8GB of VRAM to the table, as well as a better bus width. 6GB certainly aren't ideal, but for the majority of games out there currently, it's enough it seems. After all, one can't change anything about it now that AMD has followed NVIDIA's footsteps apparently. They are doing the same thing right now. Generally speaking though, this whole move of unlocking a new graphics card through a BIOS update could leave a bitter aftertaste in one's mouth. NVIDIA could have adjusted their pricing any time, and a company such as AMD should know better. Therefore, they should have given us more for the price in the first place. NVIDIA played this well and apparently made good use of AMD's naivety. Team Red found itself in a nasty trap, the escape of which isn't that easy. After all, the consumer isn't that stupid. Nonetheless, when taking into account the pricing and performance of all these graphics cards, the RX 5600 XT doesn't actually seem to be a bad choice. On average, for slightly less money, you're getting the same, if not sometimes better performance than with an RTX 2060. At the end of the day, we can still congratulate AMD, it turned out to be a good graphics card. Maybe a little pointless, but good. Although the GTX 1660 Super, generally speaking, appears to be the better value from a price to performance point of view than the 5600 XT and even RTX 2060, in my opinion. Regardless of that, I can give today's Sapphire RX 5600 XT Pulse with a new BIOS flashed my gold award. I just hope future releases will have less chaos involved. With that being said, thank you so much for watching.